Hey guys, this is Brother Scott with the Potter's House in Paris and in Dresden, Tennessee. The other day we done a video looking at Revelation 1 and 8 and called it Who is Speaking. I want to do a part 2 of that video to further, I guess, clarify what I was saying and bringing up some other proof scriptures. So what really spurred that video, making that video, was this copy of a Hebrew manuscript of Revelation 1 and 8. And I showed in that video two other copies, the same scripture in Revelation 1 and 8. I'll just show you one of these again. This is the one that I showed the other day that says in the King James, "Thus saith Yahweh." And so the question I asked the other day was, who did John understand to be speaking when he says, "I am the Aleph and the Tav, the beginning and the ending"? That is Yeshua speaking. No one, I think, would refute that Yeshua is the one making that statement. And then John says in the King James, saith Yahweh. So we understand with just that part that John understood Yeshua, and the apostles understood Yeshua to be Yahweh, not another person in the Godhead, but he understood him to be Yahweh in the flesh. And we understand that too. Even Paul understood that in one of his letters. He makes the comment that Yah was manifested in the flesh. But moving on, there was the phrase that we did not address in that video the other day, and that is the phrase also in that scripture that says, "which is, and which was, and which is to come." And I found that, and I printed this out, which is that phrase. And I sent this to a rabbi friend of mine just to make sure that my understanding was correct. And I asked him, I said, "What does this say?" And he come back to me and he said, and I'm going to read it in the Hebrew. I probably won't pronounce everything correctly, but it says, "Asher Yaha Hovei Vahu Labo." And that would be the same thing that is said here. And it says, "who was and is coming." Well, when we, and John makes that statement. Okay, John makes that statement. Who was and is coming. Who did he understand was coming? He understood that Yeshua was coming back. He is going to be returning. And so the question I had for the rabbi when he come back with that, I said, is this a reference to the name of Elohim? And he said, yes, it is. And he said this, and he is a believer in Yeshua, Messiah. And he says this is a reference, and he said in Revelation, he said this is a reference to Yeshua. He says, and it by John making this reference, he is identifying Yeshua as Yahweh. Okay, so we need to remember that. So John, by making this statement, who was and is coming, is referencing the name given in Exodus chapter 3, when Moses says, "Who will I tell them sent me?" And Yah says, "Tell them that I am has sent you." Or that Yahweh has sent you. So So John is referencing back to that. He's letting the reader understand that Yeshua is Yahweh. So I want to go on down in this chapter a little bit and bring out some other points that where John is pointing to Yeshua is Yahweh. If we go to verse 10 of chapter 1 of Revelation, he says, I was in the Spirit, and I'm reading from the Restoration Study Bible. Revelation 1 and 10 says, I was in the Spirit on Yahweh's day, and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet. We talked about this voice of a trumpet in the previous video, and how that at Mount Sinai, when they heard Yah speak, they heard the sound of the trumpet, the sound of shofar. In verse 11 says, saying, I am Aleph and Tav, or it's going to say Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. And what thou seest, write in a book, and send it unto the 7 assemblies which are in Asia, unto Ephesus, and unto Smyrna, and unto Pergamos, and unto Thyatira, and unto Sardis, and unto Philadelphia, and unto Laodicea. But let's go back up to the first part of verse 11. So when he says, I am the Aleph and the Tav, he's just repeating what he said in verse 8. Same person speaking. No one is going to make an argument that it is Yeshua who is saying these words. And Yeshua is saying, I am the Aleph and the Tav, the first and the last. So when we take this phrase, the first and the last, the question has to come up, do we find this anywhere else in the scriptures? This phrase, the first and the last. Let's go to Isaiah 41 and 4, I believe. And it says in Isaiah 41 and 4, Who hath wrought and done it, calling the generation from the beginning? And here's, listen to what he says. I, Yahweh, the first and with the last, I am He. So Yahweh saying, I am the first and I am the last. Let's go to Isaiah 44. And I believe it's verse 6. Listen to this one. Thus saith Yahweh, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, Yahweh of hosts, I am the first and I am the last, and beside me there is no Elohim. And then let's go to one more. Isaiah 48 and 12. It says, Hearken unto me, O Jacob and Israel, my called. I am He, I am the first, I also am the last. So here we have 3 scriptures where Yahweh declares himself to be the first and to be the last. We have in Revelation 1 and 11, Yeshua saying that he is the first and the last. So there would be some that would say, well, this is for a period of time and that's for a period of time, and they're swapping the throne back and forth, back and forth. I would disagree. The scriptures tell us, Yahweh himself says, his glory he will not share with another. And we're going to kind of look at something like that a little bit later. But let's go to Revelation 21. In verse 6. It says, and he said unto me, this is the one sitting on the throne, I am Alpha and Omega. Get there. The beginning and the ending. And I'll give unto him that athirst of the fountain of water of life freely. Because we understand that it was Yeshua made the same claim in John, or made the same statement in John 7, speaking of himself. Whoever is thirsty, come unto me. Without going to reading that scripture. Same statement made by Yeshua. And let's go to 22 and verse 13. Yeshua speaking here. Says, I'm the Aleph and the Tav, the beginning and the ending, the first and the last. So here's a strong indication that the one, you only have one first and one last. God's not going to share his glory with another. He is the beginning, he is the ending, he is the first, he is the last. John in verse 8 makes it very plain that Yeshua is Yahweh when he makes the phrase which is and who was and who is coming. So let's go on down to verse 12 of Revelation chapter 1. And it says, and I turned to see the voice that spake with me, and being turned I saw 7 golden candlesticks. In the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to his foot, and girt about with paps, and with a golden girdle. And his head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire. And his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. So there's no, here again, this is an area where there is no argument whatsoever that John is describing for us Yeshua. So he turns around, he hears the voice, and he turns around and he sees Yeshua. He says he likened him to the Son of Man. Well, let's go to Daniel chapter 7. We're going to see that Daniel sees if I can get there. Daniel sees the same thing in verse 9. And this is who Daniel describes. And I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning wheels. And then verse 10, a fiery stream issued and come forth from before him. Thousands ministered to him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was said, and the books were open. So John is describing Yeshua, and so he's likened to the Son of Man. And Daniel sees the same individual, same description, and says it was the Ancient of Days. Well, who is known as the Ancient of Days? Yahweh. Yahweh. In verse 15 of Revelation 1, John says that his voice was as a sound of many waters. Let's go to Ezekiel 43. In verse 2, and this is what Ezekiel says. And behold, the glory of the Elohim, the glory of Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel came from the way of the east, and his voice was like a noise of many waters, and the earth shined with his glory. So Ezekiel likens the voice of Yahweh as the voice of many waters. In Revelation 1:15, let's see if it's the same way in the King James, it says sound of many waters. But this word sound in the Greek also means voice. So he is describing the same voice that Ezekiel heard. John says that's the same voice that I heard, who proclaimed to be the Aleph and the Tav, the beginning and the ending, the first and the last, which was, which is, and which is coming. And he says that is Yeshua. Yeshua is Yahweh, is what John is bringing out. This is who he believed Yeshua to be. Now, when we look, and we're not going to go real far into this, where time is ticking on us, and I want to wrap this part up. We may do a part 3 to this. But in the scriptures and in Revelation, Yeshua is given titles that was also given to Yahweh. Here again, you cannot say, well, they're swapping places, or this one's going to rule for a period, and this one's going to rule for a period. It's the same person, because here again, Yah himself says he's not going to share his glory with another. He says, I'm a jealous Elohim. I'm a jealous God. But let's look at an example in 1 Timothy chapter 6. And let's go to verse 14. This is Paul writing to Timothy. And he says that they'll keep this commandment without spot, unrebukable, until the appearing of our Master Yeshua, Messiah. The King James, I believe, probably going to say Lord. But of our Master Yeshua, Messiah, verse 15. Which in his times he shall show who is the blessed and only potentate, the King of kings. And the King James is going to say Lord of lords. The Restoration Bible says, and Master of masters. Speaking of Yeshua as the King of kings and the Master of masters. So this was, or Lord of lords, this was a title, descriptive title given to Yahweh. Well, let's go back to Revelation chapter 17 and verse 14. John, here again, no one can deny the fact that John here is writing about Yeshua. And it says, and these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is, and the restoration is going to say here, sovereign of sovereigns. I believe that the King James, let me get there quickly. It's going to say Lord of lords. Okay, so sovereign of sovereigns and King of kings. And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Here again, John is using descriptive titles used to describe Yahweh, but he is applying them to Yeshua. Let's go to Revelation 19 and 16. Well, let's go all the way to go back to verse 11. It says, "And I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. His eyes were like as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns, and he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of Yahweh." Let's go to John 1. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Yah, and the Word was Yah." Verse 14. "And the armies which are in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed with fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth," speaking of this here again, no one would deny this is speaking of Yeshua. "And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, and with it he would smite the nations, and he would rule them with the rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness with the wrath of El Shaddai." Verse 16 says, "And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Sovereign of Sovereigns, Lord of Lords." Here again, John writing, speaking of Yeshua, and here again he puts the descriptive titles given to Yahweh in describing Yeshua. So do we see these titles given to Yah in the Old Testament? Keep in mind, and I keep saying this over and over again, keep in mind that Yahweh says, "I will not share my glory with another." So if he's given a title, he's not going to share that title and the glory that comes with that title with anybody else. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 10. Here we go. In verse 17 says, "For Yahweh your Elohim is," listen to what he is, "Elohim of Elohim, God of gods, and Sovereign of sovereigns, Lord of lords, a great El, a mighty and terrible, which regardeth not person nor taketh reward." So here, the description that is given to Yahweh is Elohim of Elohims and Sovereign of sovereigns, Lord of lords. It is how they are giving him the descriptive title. Let's go to Psalms 136. This will be the last one that we go to. And this is what is written, Psalms 136 and 3. "Oh, give thanks to the sovereign of sovereigns, for his mercy endureth forever." The writer here says, "Oh, give thanks to the sovereign of sovereigns, Lord of lords." He is here again giving this descriptive title to Yahweh. So as we see, as we go through the scriptures, and we allow scripture to define scripture, who did John understand to be speaking to him when the person made the declaration, "I am the Aleph and the Tav," or you want to say the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending, the first and the last? John says that's what Yahweh says. But it was Yeshua who was making the statement. And John says, "I looked behind me to see who was speaking, to where the voice was coming from." And he gives a description of the Ancient of Days there. is who he describes according to Daniel chapter 7, which that was Yeshua, but John describes us the Ancient of Days standing there. And then he says, and his voice was like the voice of many waters. And Ezekiel says his voice, the voice of Yahweh, was as a voice of many waters. John said, I heard the same sounds that my ancestors heard when the Almighty Yod spoke, and it was the voice of Yahweh, is who he heard speaking. It was Yeshua that he heard speaking, and John understood that to be, understood Yeshua to be Yahweh in flesh. Yahweh, as Paul put it, Yah manifested in flesh. I ask that you would consider these things. Until next time, shalom.